Alexander died at the age of 32 in Babylon as he was planning yet more conquests. As he lay dead, shock and dismay spread through his entourage. Did he die of alcohol, of fever, or did jealous Macedonian rivals poison him? Whoever possessed his body would be seen as his heir, and Macedonian generals prepared to take it back to Greece, in spite of Alexander's deathbed command to be buried at Sewa. A vast wheeled temple taking 2 years to build housed and transported his divine remains. Hauled by 64 mules and preceded by an army of road builders, it travelled through his empire. The occupants of the towns and villages it went through paid homage as if a very god was passing them by. As the procession went through Syria, Alexander's close friend Ptolemy, who was governor of Egypt, hijacked it and diverted it towards the Nile. But in the end, even Ptolemy ignored his king's dying wish and took the body back to his new Egyptian capital, Alexandria. Out of the death of the historical Alexander was born something new and lasting. For the Greeks, the godlike saviors and supermen of their mythical past had finally crystallized into human form.
Gradually, there developed the notion, both in his lifetime and very much more afterwards, that Alexander had been sent from heaven, that he had, as it were, been loaned to the world for a limited period, and that upon his death, the gift had been revoked.
The people that were in his immediate entourage, his colleagues, his generals, they certainly see him as somebody who is marked out by the divine. Stories about how when he was marching along the coast in southern Turkey, the sea bowed down to do him homage, is told by one of the people that was in his entourage.
To the Greeks, divinity was not a matter of supreme goodness or holiness. It was all about awesome, invisible power, which, if you could tap into it with the right rituals, sacrifices, and so on, could confer great benefactions.
His successors who take over his fragmented kingdom, they use Alexander, they use his image, and they use the idea of kings being gods.
Surely the ultimate example of Alexander's heirs seeing themselves as divine is to be found here in the remote mountains of eastern Turkey. A dirt track winds up to a vast mausoleum complex on the top of Mount Nemrut. The creator of this place was King Antiochus I of Commagene, whose head has toppled down from his throne over there. He ruled the region about 2,000 years ago. The scene here says it all. The headless statue of Antiochus sits seemingly on the roof of the world, indeed on the very threshold of heaven. By presuming to seat himself among the gods, with the goddess of plenty on one side and Apollo on the other, Antiochus is in effect telling us that he is one of them. And here he shakes hands with the god Apollo, as if they were equals. Now come and look at the inscription on the back of the statues, where Antiochus, in his own words, sets out his religious beliefs. Here, boring old grammar proves to be the most potent tool for bringing his deepest thoughts to life. Now, over here, in the nominative case, is his name and his titles, meaning that he is the subject. And over here is a verb in the first person, ekoi esamen, I made, meaning he's saying, I did such and such. And this is a verb in the present tense, horas, you see, meaning that he was alive when the text was composed. And over here is the ancient Greek passage, Antiochos Theos, meaning he's saying, I am a living God. Well, you could be forgiven for thinking that Alexander's impact had peaked here in these mountains. But his conquests did not stop here, of course. They extended several thousand more miles eastwards, to India, where his arrival triggered changes as dramatic as these, but in the mind. And this also applied down here to the south in the homeland of Judaism, where Alexander's influence brought about a transformation in Jewish attitudes in the years leading up to the birth of Christ. This assimilation of Greek ideas as a result of Alexander, Hellenization as it's called, resulted in the whole of the known world becoming one melting pot of religious ideas. Current research is now revealing for the first time that remarkably Alexander affected the religions of India, Islam and early Christianity, and key aspects of Judaism. A new sort of Jewish leader emerged, a teacher or rabbi, based on the idea of Greek philosophical schools. Here by the burning bush is the great Jewish hero Moses, now in a Greek-style robe. On this synagogue floor is the pagan Greek sun god, Helios. Behind his head is a disk and rays representing the sun. And again, with flares of light to emphasize his divine radiance, is a successor to Alexander in Syria, Antiochus VI, taking on the concept of a god-king. These successor kings went further. A later Syrian king, Demetrius III, is calling himself Theos and Soter, God and Saviour. When the Romans became the imperial power following the Greeks, they too decided that, like Alexander, they were god-kings. Here, Augustus is calling himself Divi Filius, son of a god. And in the early Christian era, the Emperor Nero goes one further and sports a radiate crown to suggest his divinity. And here, in this early mosaic from beneath the Vatican, and adorned with the self-same solar flares used by the Roman emperors, is the leader of the newly emerging religion of Christianity, Jesus.
Conventional Christians usually think that Jesus was naturally divine, and that the early Christians did not need to interpret his divinity, but simply record what they had experienced of him.
Although mainstream theology continues to emphasize the Old Testament precedents for the launch of Christianity, and maintains that something pretty unusual happened around the death of Jesus, the controversial Professor Burton Mack does not think that the Jesus of the early church came from the Jewish tradition.
The kings of Israel, as they were seen, portrayed, and eulogized in later historical reports, were never understood to be divine. So the notion of divinity, and especially of a universal royal divine figure, it just does not come from the Israelite tradition.
His radical solution is to look elsewhere for the inspiration for the Christ we have today.
This fascination with Alexander is that you have, for the first time, a clear concept of a man-god. And so at the same time as we have this marvelous romance of Alexander filling the mentality of the time, we have the Gospels being written about Jesus, and the similarities are striking.
In a nutshell, Professor Mack is making the revolutionary claim that the fundamental nature of Christ as both man and God ultimately derived from the Greek tradition of the divinity of Alexander. Of course, the message of Jesus, as opposed to his packaging, was new and based on non-violence and a God of love.